The candles in the great hall had not even finished burning when Alara Whitmore heard her own name spoken as a mistake. "There must be some confusion," she said, standing very still in her pale blue gown, the one she had chosen for tonight, because Julian once told her blue suited her. "The invitations say Camille." Her mother did not look up from the guest list. "Yes, Camille. But the betrothal was mine." The room, full of relatives and neighbors who had come for what they believed was an engagement dinner, went quiet in that particular way. Rooms go quiet when everyone already knows the answer, and is only waiting to see who will say it first. It was her father who finally spoke, his voice low, as if lowering it might soften the blow. Julian asked for Camille. There is nothing more to discuss. Alara felt the floor tilt beneath her, though she did not move. 2 years. 2 years of quiet visits, of letters folded and kept in the bottom of her writing desk, of a promise made under the oak tree behind the chapel when Julian had taken her hand and said her name like it belonged to him. 2 years. And now her own sister stood across the room in a gown the color of ripe wine, smiling the smile of someone who has already won, and wants everyone to watch her enjoy it. "Camille," Alara's voice came out steadier than she expected. "Look at me, and tell me this was not your doing." Camille lifted her chin. She was beautiful in the way that made people forgive her almost anything. Dark curls pinned high, eyes bright with something that was not quite guilt. "Julian chose me, Alara. I did not force him. You have been in my parlor with him 3 times this month. I did not think anything of it because I trusted you. Perhaps that was your mistake." A murmur passed through the guests. The kind of murmur that meant the story would be repeated at every dinner table in town before the week was through. Alara looked at her mother, who studied her hands. She looked at her father, who studied the wall. Neither of them would meet her eyes, and in that refusal she understood everything she needed to understand. This had been decided before she walked into the room. Perhaps it had been decided weeks ago. In quiet conversations she had not been invited to join. "Where is Julian?" she asked. "He is coming later," her mother said. "He did not wish to cause a scene. He is allowing my sister to cause it for him." "Alara," her father's voice sharpened now, warning her the way he might warn a servant who had spoken out of turn. "This family cannot afford your pride tonight. You know our situation. Camille's match secures us. Yours would have done the same, but it no longer matters which daughter wears the ring, only that the ring is worn. It no longer matters which daughter." Alara turned the words over and found they cut deeper than anything Camille had said. To her father, she and her sister were not 2 different people with 2 different hearts. They were interchangeable pieces on a board, and he had simply moved the wrong one back into place. She did not cry in front of them. She had learned long ago that tears in this house were treated as weapons to be used against her, proof of instability, proof that she could not be trusted with anything important. So she stood in her pale blue gown, the one Julian said suited her, and she let the guests watch her sister accept congratulations meant for someone else. It was near midnight when Julian finally arrived. He found her alone on the terrace, away from the candlelight and the laughter drifting out through the open doors. For a moment he looked as though he might apologize. Instead he glanced back toward the hall, toward the sound of Camille's voice rising in delight over some compliment, and he said only, "I did not know how to tell you. You did not have to tell me anything. You could have simply not done it. Camille said you had grown distant. She said you no longer wished for the match. And you believed her instead of asking me." He had no answer for that. Alara watched him search for words that would make this easier for him, words that would let him walk back inside and enjoy the rest of his engagement dinner without the weight of what he had done pressing on his chest. She decided she would not give him that comfort. "Good night, Julian," she said, and walked past him into the dark garden, where at least the roses did not pretend to be anything other than what they were. The weeks that followed were the quietest of her life. She was not forbidden from the wedding preparations, but she was not truly included in them either. She sat through fittings where Camille turned in front of the mirror, asking whether the lace made her look too young to be a bride, and Alara answered honestly, because honesty was the only thing she had left to give that was entirely hers. She helped address invitations in her careful handwriting, her own name absent from the guest of honor list, present only as a footnote, the unmarried sister who would sit near the back. Her mother tried, once, to explain. "You will find someone else, Alara. You are patient. Patience is a virtue men value." Patience did not save my engagement. It only meant I did not fight for it while everyone else decided my future without me. Her mother had no response to that, and after a moment she left the room, as though Alara's grief were a fire that might spread if she stood too close to it. Camille, for her part, seemed almost puzzled by Alara's coldness. She would appear in Alara's doorway some evenings, asking small questions about ribbon colors or seating arrangements, as though the two of them were still the sisters who used to share a bed during thunderstorms as children, whispering stories until the lightning stopped frightening them. Ilara answered these questions politely and nothing more. She had decided that politeness would be her armor now, since anger only gave people something to point at and call unreasonable. The estate itself seemed to be shrinking around her. Whitmore House had once felt grand to her as a child, its halls wide and its gardens endless, but lately every room reminded her of something taken. The music room where she had practiced duets with Julian, the library where he had first told her he loved her, standing between two shelves of poetry neither of them had actually been reading. She began to take her walks farther from the house, past the edge of the property, past the stone wall where the family's land ended and the road to town began, simply to breathe air that did not carry the smell of her sister's wedding flowers. It was on one of these walks, 3 days before the wedding, that she first heard the servants speaking about the debt. She had not meant to listen. She had stopped near the kitchen garden to pick a handful of mint, and through the open window she heard the housekeeper's voice, tight with worry, speaking to the cook. Lord Whitmore owes money he cannot repay, a great deal of it. The man he owes it to is coming himself, they say, rather than sending a clerk. Who would come himself for a debt? They say it is the Duke of Ravenswood. The name meant little to Ilara at the time, only a distant title she had heard mentioned, with a kind of careful fear at dinners she rarely attended in full. She thought nothing more of it that evening. She had her own sorrow to carry, and it seemed, in that moment, heavy enough without adding a stranger's business troubles to the weight of it. The wedding took place on a bright afternoon that Ilara would remember only in fragments. The white flowers along the chapel aisle, her mother crying tears of genuine joy, the kind she had never cried for Ilara. Julian standing at the front in a dark coat, looking, Ilara thought, less like a man marrying the woman he loved, and more like a man who had simply stopped fighting the current he was caught in. Camille walked down the aisle glowing, radiant, everything a bride is meant to be, and when she passed Ilara's pew she gave her sister a small, satisfied smile, as though inviting her to share in the triumph. Ilara did not smile back. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, and watched the ceremony the way one watches weather from behind a window, present but untouched, waiting only for it to pass. At the wedding breakfast afterward, surrounded by guests offering congratulations to a couple that had, in Ilara's private accounting, been built on the ruins of her own happiness, she slipped away to the far end of the garden, where the noise of celebration grew thin and distant. She sat on a stone bench beneath a willow tree and allowed herself, finally, the tears she had refused to shed in front of anyone else. She did not hear the footsteps approaching until a shadow fell across the grass in front of her. She looked up expecting a servant, or perhaps her mother, come to scold her for missing the toasts. Instead, she found a man she did not recognize, dressed plainly for someone whose bearing suggested wealth, watching her with an expression she could not quite read, somewhere between curiosity and quiet understanding. "Forgive the interruption," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, the voice of a man accustomed to being listened to without needing to raise it. "I was told I might find Lord Whitmore in the garden. I did not expect to find his daughter crying instead." Ilara wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed to be seen this way by a stranger. "I am sorry. I did not realize anyone else was out here. You need not apologize for grief," he said simply. "Only for pretending it does not exist, and you are not doing that." Something in the plainness of his words struck her more than any comfort her family had offered in weeks. She studied him properly now, the dark coat, the composed stillness of a man who did not fidget or perform, the faint shadow of something guarded behind his eyes, as though he too carried a weight he did not often show. "May I ask who you are, sir?" He inclined his head slightly, and when he answered, his voice did not change, though the name itself seemed to carry its own weather into the garden. "I am the Duke of Ravenswood. I believe your father has been expecting me, though perhaps not on a day quite so full of celebration." Ilara felt a small, cold understanding settle over her, the debt the servants had whispered about, arriving in the middle of her sister's wedding, like a storm that had waited politely for the flowers to be arranged before breaking. She rose from the bench, smoothing her skirts, steadying her voice. "Then I should take you to him," she said, "though I imagine today is not the day he would have chosen for this conversation." "Few debts arrive on days anyone would choose," the Duke said, and for the briefest moment, something almost like sympathy crossed his face before it was gone again, folded neatly away behind the composure he clearly wore like armor. "Lead the way, Miss Whitmore." She had not told him her name. She wondered, walking beside him back toward the house, how he had already known it, and what else about her family he might already know that she did not. The door to her father's study slammed with such force that a vase in the hallway trembled on its stand. Alara stood just outside, unable to walk away, listening to her father's voice crack under a strain she had never heard in him before. "You cannot mean to call the entire sum at once. My daughter has just been married. The house is full of guests." "Your guests are not my concern," the Duke answered. And though his tone remained even, there was an edge beneath it now, the edge of a man who had run out of patience long before he walked through the door. "You have delayed payment for 11 months, Lord Whitmore. I have sent 3 letters. I received 3 excuses. I did not travel here today to receive a 4th. I can pay you within the year. Give me until spring. You told me spring would come a year ago." Alara pressed her hand against the wall, her heart beating fast. She had known her family's finances were strained. Everyone whispered about it eventually, but she had never understood the size of the hole they had dug, nor how close they stood to falling into it. Through the door she heard her father's voice drop to something close to pleading, a tone she had never once heard him use, not even on the night Camille announced her engagement to Julian. "Whatever you require, Your Grace. Tell me what will satisfy this debt, and I will find a way to give it to you." There was a long silence. When the Duke spoke again, his voice had changed, no longer sharp, but careful, as though he were choosing each word the way a man chooses stones to cross a river. "There is a way this could be resolved, without ruining you publicly, which I confess is not something I have offered to many men in your position. I have no wish to see your family's name dragged through every drawing room in the county, and no particular wish to spend the coming months collecting a debt in pieces through the courts. Name it. I require a wife." Alara's breath caught. She heard her father's confused silence through the door, and then his voice, careful now too. "Your Grace, I do not follow. You have 2 daughters. One is married as of this afternoon. The other, I understand, is not." A pause. "I am told she is sensible, and unlike her sister, not inclined toward dramatics. I find I have little patience left for dramatics in my own household. If she agrees to marry me, I will forgive the debt entirely, and settle a further sum on your estate besides. If she does not, I expect full payment within 30 days, by whatever means you can manage it." Alara stood frozen in the hallway, her hand still pressed against the wall, listening to her own future being decided for the second time in a single month, this time not by her sister's ambition but by a stranger's convenience. She thought of walking away, of pretending she had never heard any of it, but her feet would not move. Her father opened the door sooner than she expected, and found her standing there, pale, clearly having heard everything. For a moment something like shame crossed his face, quickly replaced by something more practical. "Alara, come in. There is a matter we must discuss." She stepped into the study and found the Duke standing near the window, his hands folded behind his back, watching her with the same unreadable expression he had worn in the garden. He did not look away when she entered, and he did not look apologetic either, as though he understood perfectly well that she had heard the entire arrangement and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. "I imagine you heard enough of that conversation to understand the offer," he said, before her father could speak for her, which she found, oddly, easier to bear than if he had spoken around her as though she were not in the room. "I heard that my hand is worth a debt my father cannot pay." "That is one way to describe it." He studied her a moment longer. "I will not pretend this is romantic, Miss Whitmore. It is a transaction, and I think you are clever enough to prefer honesty about that, over pretty words that mean nothing. In exchange for your agreement, your father's debt is cleared, your family's name remains untouched, and you become the Duchess of Ravenswood, with a household of your own, and an authority no one in this house has ever given you. I ask nothing of you beyond your presence and your discretion." Her father's eyes were fixed on her now, pleading in a way that made her stomach turn. The same eyes that had refused to meet hers 3 weeks ago when her engagement was quietly stolen and handed to her sister. She almost laughed at the strangeness of it, that the same man who could not look at her then now looked at her as though she were the only thing standing between him and ruin. "And if I refuse?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Then I collect the debt as agreed, and your family's circumstances become considerably more difficult, and rather more public." The Duke's voice remained level, without threat in it, simply fact laid plainly on the table. "I will not pretend that is not a pressure upon you. It is. I would rather you agree freely, but I understand freedom is a luxury not everyone in this room can afford today." Alara looked at her father, whose hands trembled slightly at his sides, a man she had once believed unshakable, now revealed as fragile as anyone else when the right pressure was applied. She thought of the pale blue gown, of Julian's hand under the oak tree, of 2 years of promises that had meant nothing the moment her sister decided she wanted them for herself. She thought of a house that had never once, in all her 21 years, asked what she wanted before deciding what she would receive. "I have one condition," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. The Duke raised an eyebrow slightly, the first genuine flicker of interest she had seen cross his face. "Go on." "I will not be treated as a piece of furniture in your household, purchased and placed in a corner to be admired when convenient and ignored otherwise. If I am to be your wife in name, I will run your household as its true mistress, with real authority, not a title borrowed for appearances." For a moment the study was silent. Then, unexpectedly, something that might almost have been the beginning of respect crossed the Duke's face. "That is not a condition I would have needed to grant. Most in your position would have simply agreed and asked for jewels instead." "I am not most, your grace." "No," he said slowly, as though reconsidering something. "I begin to see that you are not." He extended his hand, not in the manner of a suitor, but in the manner of two parties closing a difficult negotiation. Ilara looked at it for a long moment, aware of her father watching, aware of the life she was choosing in this single motion, a life with a man whose reputation had followed him into this room like a shadow he did not bother to explain. She thought of Camille's wedding that very afternoon, of white flowers and false smiles, and she thought that whatever waited for her at Ravenswood, at least it would be hers, chosen with her eyes open, rather than handed to her by people who had never once asked what she wanted. She placed her hand in his. "Then we are agreed," he said. "I will send for you within the week. Bring only what you wish to keep for yourself, Miss Whitmore. Everything else, you will find, I am able to provide." Her father did not follow her out of the study, but he called her name once more before she reached the stairs, and when she turned, she saw something in his face she had never seen there before, something close to shame that he did not quite know how to voice. "Ilara, I know this is not what you wanted." "No," she agreed, "it is not. But you understand why it must be done. I understand that it is easier for you to hand me to a stranger than to admit you failed to protect what was mine in the first place." She kept her voice quiet, without cruelty, only truth. "I am not refusing him, father. I only want you to know that I see clearly what this is, and I will not pretend otherwise for your comfort." He had no reply to that, and she did not wait for one. That evening, alone in her room, she opened the small drawer of her writing desk where she had kept Julian's letters for 2 years. Ribbon-tied and read so many times the folds had softened to cloth. She read them once more, not out of longing but out of a need to close a door properly rather than leave it swinging in the wind, and then she carried them to the hearth, and watched the flames take them, page by page, until nothing remained but ash, and a strange, clean quiet in her chest, where the grief had been. The household staff learned of her engagement within a day, as household staff always do, and word of the Duke's reputation traveled through the servants' quarters faster than any official announcement could have managed. Nora, the housekeeper who had cared for Ilara since she was a child too small to reach the top shelf of the pantry, came to her room the night before her departure, with a shawl in her hands, and worry written plainly across her face. "They say he is a hard man, my lady. They say his own household in the north lost 3 stewards in as many years, and that his first betrothed left him standing at the altar itself, though no one quite agrees on the reason why. They say a great many things, Nora. Most of what people say about men with power is shaped more by fear than by fact. And if it is fact?" Ilara took the shawl from her hands and folded it carefully into her trunk. "Then I will learn to manage a hard man the way I have managed a hard family. I am not without practice." Nora's eyes filled, and she pulled Ilara into an embrace far less proper than any lady's maid ought to offer, but Ilara held onto her just as tightly, grateful for the one person in the house whose affection had never once wavered or been withdrawn as punishment. "You were always the steadier of the two," Nora whispered against her hair. "I told your mother so more than once. She did not wish to hear it, because Camille was easier to admire, and you were easier to overlook. But easier is not the same as better, my lady. Do not let anyone at Ravenswood convince you otherwise." "I will try to remember that. See that you do, and write to me when you are settled. I do not care what they say of the Duke. I care only that you are safe, and that whatever quiet you find there is a quiet you have chosen, not one forced upon you." Ilara promised she would, and though she did not entirely believe, that night, that safety was a thing waiting for her at the end of this bargain, she found some comfort in Nora's words regardless. Better was not the same as easier. She intended to hold on to that thought the way she once held on to Julian's letters, except this time, she would not need to burn it when it disappointed her. The days that followed passed in a strange, hollow rush. Her mother wept, though Ilara could not tell whether the tears were for her daughter's sudden departure, or for the scandal narrowly avoided, and suspected, privately, It was mostly the latter. Camille, back from her brief wedding trip, arrived at the house pale with disbelief when she heard the news, and for once had nothing clever to say. "You are marrying the Duke of Ravenswood," she said, as though testing whether the words might rearrange themselves into something less strange if she said them aloud. "The one they say buried two mistresses' hearts and ruined every man who crossed him." "Then perhaps you should be relieved," Elara said, folding a shawl into her traveling trunk with careful hands. "You will no longer have to share a house with the sister you outmaneuvered. You may enjoy Julian and this house entirely to yourself." "Elara, I did not mean for any of this to happen to you. You meant for exactly what happened to happen, Camille. You simply did not consider what would happen to me afterward, because you never do." Elara closed the trunk and looked at her sister properly for what she suspected might be the last time in a long while. "I am not angry anymore. I do not have the energy left for it. But do not pretend, now that my fortune has changed shape, that you are suddenly concerned for my welfare." Camille had no answer for that, and Elara did not wait for one. On the morning she left Whitmore House, she did not look back at the windows of the home she had grown up in, nor at the garden where Julian had once told her he loved her, nor at the chapel where her sister had married the man meant for someone else. She climbed into the carriage sent by the Duke of Ravenswood, a stranger she had agreed to marry in exchange for her family's survival. And as the wheels began to turn beneath her, she felt, for the first time in weeks, something other than grief. She felt the faint, uncertain shape of a future that, whatever else it might hold, would not be decided by anyone in that house again. The wedding at Ravenswood was small, quiet, and over almost before Elara understood it had properly begun. There were no crowds of well-wishers, no white flowers lining an aisle, no sister glowing in borrowed happiness. There was a chapel on the estate grounds, a clergyman who spoke the words quickly, as though sensing neither party wished to linger over them, and the Duke's steady hand closing around hers when the ring was placed. Within the hour, Elara Whitmore no longer existed. She was the Duchess of Ravenswood, wife to a man she had known for less than a month, standing in a house 3 times the size of the one she had grown up in and feeling, for the first time in her life, entirely invisible in her own new position. The trouble began on her second morning, before she had even learned the names of half the household staff. She came down to the breakfast room to find the housekeeper, a stern woman named Griselda who had run the estate for over a decade, already giving orders to the kitchen staff for the day's menu, orders Elara had not been consulted on. "Mrs. Griselda," Elara said, keeping her tone pleasant despite the small flare of irritation in her chest, "I would like to review the household accounts and the weekly menus going forward. I understand you have managed things well in my absence, and I do not intend to undo good work, but I was told this house would be mine to run." Griselda's expression did not change, but something in her posture stiffened. "His Grace has always left such matters to me, my lady. I would not wish to burden you with details you are not yet familiar with. I am not asking to be spared the burden. I am asking for what was promised to me." Elara held the woman's gaze without flinching, remembering the years she had spent learning exactly this skill, in a house that had never once yielded to her without a fight. "You may keep every habit that serves this household well, but the ledgers will come to me each week, and any decision above the smallest household matter will be mine to make, not yours to decide on my behalf." For a long moment, Griselda said nothing, clearly testing whether this new mistress might be pushed aside as easily as the whispers among the staff had predicted. Then, to Elara's quiet relief, the housekeeper inclined her head, not quite warmly, but with something that might grow into respect given time. "As you wish, my lady. I will have the ledgers sent to your study by evening." It was a small victory, but Elara understood its importance. The staff had been watching to see whether their new mistress would fold under the weight of a household built around a man everyone feared, or whether she would stand her ground the way she had promised the Duke she would. Word of the exchange, she suspected, would travel through the servants' quarters by nightfall, just as word of her engagement had traveled through her father's house weeks before. This time, she intended the story to work in her favor. The Duke himself remained a puzzle she could not quite solve. He kept to his own wing of the house for much of each day, occupied with correspondence and business she was not invited to share, and their meals together were brief, civil, and largely silent. He asked after her comfort each evening with the same careful politeness a man might use with a guest he respected but did not yet know well, and she answered in kind, both of them circling each other with the caution of two people who had agreed to build a life together out of necessity rather than affection, and were not yet certain how much of themselves they were willing to risk offering the other. It was a small thing, at first, that began to change her understanding of him. She had mentioned once, in passing, over a quiet dinner in her second week, that she missed the poetry collection she had left behind at Whitmore House, a worn volume her grandmother had given her before she died. She had not asked him for anything. She had simply mentioned it the way one mentions any small loss, without expectation. 3 days later, a parcel arrived at her study, wrapped plainly, containing not one volume of poetry but 4, each a different edition, each inscribed on the first page in his own steady hand, with a note that read only, "I did not know which edition your grandmother owned, so I purchased them all. You may discard the ones that do not suit you." She sat with the books in her lap for a long while after reading the note, turning the strangeness of it over in her mind. This was not the man the servants whispered about in frightened tones, the man rumored to have ruined every rival who crossed him. This was a man who remembered a passing comment and acted on it without being asked, without expecting thanks, without even mentioning it to her face. She found him in his study that evening, a room she had not yet been invited into, and knocked softly on the open door. He looked up from his papers, faint surprise crossing his features at finding her there. "Thank you for the books," she said simply. "You did not need to do that." "No," he agreed, "I did not." "Then why did you?" He set down his pen, considering the question longer than she expected. "Because you asked for nothing when you had every right to ask for a great deal, and I found that I wished to give you something regardless." He paused, something guarded flickering behind his eyes before he continued. "I am not accustomed to people in my household wanting little from me. Most who come near a title like mine want quite a lot, and are not shy about asking for it. I am not most people, Your Grace." "So you told me, in your father's study. I am beginning to believe you." A faint, almost reluctant smile touched the corner of his mouth, gone as quickly as it appeared, but Alara found she had noticed it all the same, and found herself wanting to see it again. Their first true test as a married couple came a month later, at a gathering hosted by a neighboring family, the kind of event Alara would once have attended as an overlooked younger daughter, and now attended as a duchess whose presence commanded attention whether she wished for it or not. Camille was there as well, on Julian's arm, and Alara felt the familiar tightening in her chest at the sight of her sister, though she was determined not to let old wounds show on her face in front of a room full of strangers eager for gossip. Camille approached during a lull in the music, her smile sweet in the way that had always meant something sharp was coming beneath it. "Alara, how grand you look. Married to a duke now, of all things. I confess I did not expect such fortune to fall on you, given how things ended with Julian." "Fortune had little to do with it, Camille. You will recall the circumstances better than most, given your part in creating them." A few heads turned nearby, drawn by the edge in Alara's voice despite her attempt to keep it level. Camille's smile tightened. "I only meant that it is remarkable how quickly you recovered from a broken engagement. One might almost think you were not so heartbroken as you claimed to be." "One might also consider that grief looks different on a person who was not permitted the luxury of falling apart in front of an audience," Alara replied, "though I would not expect you to understand the difference, having never once had anything taken from you that you did not first take from someone else." The words landed harder than Alara intended, and for a moment, Camille's composure cracked entirely, something raw and unhappy flashing across her face before she could smooth it away. It was in that silence that the Duke appeared at Alara's side, having crossed the room without either sister noticing, his presence settling over the small gathering like a change in weather. "Lady Ashford," he said to Camille, his tone perfectly courteous and entirely without warmth, "I trust your evening is a pleasant one. My wife and I were just discussing how quickly circumstances can change for a family, once the truth of certain arrangements becomes known more widely. I imagine you understand that better than most, given how your own engagement came about." Camille's face went pale. It was not a threat, not precisely, but the implication sat clearly enough in the room, that the Duke of Ravenswood knew exactly how Alara's engagement had been stolen, and was not above reminding a room full of listening ears of that fact if provoked further. Camille excused herself soon after, drawing Julian away with a tight hand on his arm, and did not approach Alara again for the remainder of the evening. In the carriage home, Alara turned to her husband, still faintly astonished. "You did not need to defend me. I am aware. Then why did you?" He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the passing dark hedgerows rather than at her. "Because I watched a room full of people ready to enjoy your discomfort, and I found I had no interest in allowing that performance to continue," he said finally. "You did not ask for my help. I gave it regardless, the same as the books. I find I am doing that rather more than I intended to where you are concerned." Alara studied his profile in the dim carriage light, the sharp line of his jaw, the careful stillness he wore like a second coat, and wondered, not for the first time, what exactly lay beneath the reputation that had followed him into every room since she had known him. She did not ask that night, but she found herself, for the first time since her engagement had been stolen out from under her, genuinely curious about the man she had married, rather than simply grateful for the shelter his name provided. Word of Camille's marriage troubles reached Ravenswood not long after. Servants carried gossip between households the way birds carry seeds, and it was Nora, in a letter Ilara received with real delight, who first mentioned that Julian had grown cold toward his new wife, having apparently learned, through some indiscretion of Camille's own making, the full truth of how their engagement had come to be. Camille, it seemed, had boasted once too often to a friend about her cleverness in securing Julian for herself, and the friend had not kept the secret as carefully as Camille assumed she would. Ilara read the letter twice, expecting to feel triumph, and found instead only a distant, quiet sort of pity, the kind reserved for someone who has built a house on ground they knew was unstable, and were now watching it begin to shift beneath them. She said nothing of it to the Duke, not wishing to seem as though she measured her own happiness against her sister's unraveling. But she noticed, in the weeks that followed, that her own household had begun to feel less like a transaction and more like something else entirely, something she did not yet have the right words for, built slowly out of small kindnesses neither of them had promised the other, and neither of them seemed willing, yet, to name. A greater test of that quiet trust came on a cold night in early autumn, when a fire broke out in one of the tenant cottages at the edge of the estate. Ilara was woken by shouting in the courtyard, and the sharp smell of smoke carried on the wind, and by the time she had thrown on a coat and reached the stairs, she found the Duke already gone, riding out ahead of the household staff toward the glow visible above the tree line. She did not wait to be told to stay behind. She woke the housekeeper, ordered blankets and water carried to the cottages, and rode out herself in a small cart with two of the stable hands, arriving to find the Duke already pulling an elderly tenant and her two grandchildren clear of the smoke, his coat blackened, his composure entirely gone for the first time since Ilara had known him. He was shouting orders to the men forming a line to the well, his voice raw, his hands scraped raw from hauling buckets, and there was nothing careful or guarded about him in that moment, only urgency and a fierce, protective anger at the flames threatening people under his care. Ilara worked alongside the other women through the night, wrapping the shivering children in blankets, tending to a burn on the elderly tenant's arm with steady hands, organizing the frightened household into something resembling order. By the time the fire was finally beaten back, dawn was breaking gray over the fields, and the cottage, though damaged, still stood. The Duke found her afterward, near the well, her hands blistered and her hair loose from its pins, and he looked at her the way a man looks at something he had not expected to find. "You did not need to come," he said quietly, echoing her own words to him weeks before. "No," she answered. "I did not." "Then why did you?" "Because I watched people under this roof in danger, and I found I had no interest in staying behind, simply because no one had asked me to help." She allowed herself a small, tired smile. "It seems we have that in common, Your Grace." He studied her for a long moment in the pale morning light, something shifting behind his eyes that she could not quite name, and for the first time since their wedding, he reached out and gently took her scraped hand in his, turning it over to examine the damage with a care that had nothing to do with duty or arrangement. "You will have Griselda tend to this properly. I will not have my Duchess carrying burns because she was too stubborn to wear gloves. I will consider it, if you promise the same courtesy for your own hands." A faint, exhausted laugh escaped him, real and unguarded, the first she had heard from him since she had come to Ravenswood. "Agreed," he said, and did not release her hand for a long moment afterward, as though he had forgotten, briefly, that there was any reason he should. News of the fire, and of the Duchess who had ridden out into the night to help her husband's tenants, spread through the county faster than any wedding announcement could have managed, and Ilara found, in the weeks that followed, that the wary glances she had once received from neighboring households had softened into something closer to genuine respect. She was no longer simply the overlooked sister who had married a feared duke for convenience. She was becoming, in the eyes of those around her, a woman who had chosen to stand beside her household rather than above it. It was in the midst of this quiet change that Camille arrived at Ravenswood unannounced, her carriage pulling into the drive on a gray afternoon, while Ilara sat reviewing the household ledgers in her study. She came in pale and drawn, none of the polished confidence she had worn at her own wedding still visible in her face, and Ilara felt, despite everything, a small flicker of concern at the sight of her sister looking so unlike herself. "Camille, I did not expect you." "Julian knows," Camille said without preamble, sinking into the chair across from Ilara's desk, as though her legs could no longer hold the weight of the truth she carried. "He knows everything, about the letters, about what I said to Mother and Father, about how I convinced them the match should be mine instead of yours. He will barely speak to me now." Ilara set down her pen carefully, choosing her words with more restraint than she felt, I am sorry to hear you are unhappy, Camille, but I confess I do not know what you expect me to say. I did not come for sympathy. Camille's voice cracked slightly, and for a moment Alara saw, beneath the practiced confidence her sister had always worn so easily, someone genuinely frightened of the life she had built for herself. I came because I do not know how to fix this, and you were always the clever one, whatever anyone believed of us growing up. I need you to tell me what to do. I cannot tell you how to repair a marriage built on a lie, Camille, because I have never built anything that way. You wanted what was mine, and you took it without once considering what it would cost either of us. Whatever this costs you now, I am not the one who can undo it. Alara kept her voice even, without triumph in it, only tired honesty. I will not pretend I feel nothing at seeing you struggle, but I will not lie to you either, and tell you that I know how to mend what you broke, because I do not think it can be mended by anyone but you and Julian, and only then if he decides he wishes to try. Camille left Ravenswood that evening without the comfort she had come seeking, and Alara sat alone in her study long after the carriage had disappeared down the drive, turning over the strange, unfamiliar shape of the feeling in her chest. It was not quite triumph, and it was not quite pity. It was something closer to peace, the quiet understanding that her own happiness no longer depended on watching her sister's fortunes rise or fall, because for the first time in her life, she had begun building something that belonged entirely to her. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, and by Tuesday evening, the entire county seemed to know its contents. Alara first heard the whispers at a small gathering hosted by a family friend, the same careful sideways glances she remembered from the night her engagement to Julian had collapsed in front of a room full of witnesses, and her stomach turned cold before anyone had said a single word to her directly. It was Lady Pemberton, a woman known more for her curiosity than her kindness, who finally approached with a look of poorly disguised delight. Your Grace, I do hope you will forgive my asking, but is it true that you married the Duke only to remain near your former betrothed, and that your affections for Lord Ashford never truly cooled, even after his marriage to your sister? The question landed like a struck bell, ringing through the room in a silence that told Alara the rumor had already traveled far wider than this single conversation. I have no idea where you heard such a thing, Lady Pemberton, but I can assure you it is entirely false. Forgive me, I only ask because the letter has been rather widely discussed. It claims to be written in your own hand, addressed to Lord Ashford, expressing regret over the marriage, and a wish that circumstances had allowed you to remain together. Alara felt the floor of the room tilt beneath her exactly as it had on the night of Camille's engagement dinner, the same helpless fury at being accused of something she had never done, forced to defend herself in front of an audience eager to believe the worst. She had written no such letter. She had not spoken more than a handful of words to Julian since her wedding to the Duke. But she understood, with a sick certainty, precisely who benefited from such a rumor taking root, and precisely why it had been crafted to sound so convincingly like her own voice. She found the Duke waiting in the carriage when the gathering ended early, her excuse of a headache doing little to disguise the tension in her shoulders. He did not speak until the carriage was well away from the house, and when he did, his voice carried a coldness she had not heard from him since the day he first arrived at her father's study to collect a debt. I received a copy of the letter this afternoon, he said, not looking at her. Sent anonymously, though I suspect the sender did not intend to remain anonymous for long. I did not write it. The hand is a close match to yours. Then someone has studied my handwriting closely enough to forge it, which tells you a great deal about who wishes to see my marriage destroyed, if you are willing to consider it. Alara's voice rose despite her effort to stay calm, old wounds reopening faster than she could manage them. I have given you no reason to doubt me since the day I agreed to this marriage. I have run your household honestly. I have never once complained of the arrangement you offered me. And now, at the first hint of scandal, you are prepared to believe a stranger's forged letter over my own word. I did not say I believed it. You have said nothing at all, which in this carriage, tonight, feels rather like the same thing. The Duke was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the passing dark. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its coldness, replaced by something rawer, something Alara had not heard from him before. Forgive me. I am not accustomed to trusting easily, and I have been burned badly enough by it before that I find old instincts difficult to unlearn, even when I know better. What happened to you? He did not answer immediately, and Alara wondered whether he would answer at all, whether this was a door he intended to keep permanently closed, the way he kept so much of himself closed to the world. But then, quietly, he began to speak. I was engaged once, before you. Her name was Iris. I believed, foolishly, that she loved me for myself rather than for my title, and I trusted her completely. the way I have trusted almost no one since. 3 weeks before our wedding, she left with my younger brother, taking a significant portion of my mother's jewels with her, and leaving behind a letter explaining that she had never loved me at all, only the idea of what marrying into this family might provide her. Ilara's anger softened into something closer to understanding, though it did not entirely dissolve. That is a terrible thing to have carried alone, but I am not Iris, and I did not choose this marriage to deceive you. I know that, or I am trying to know it, even when the instinct to protect myself from being made a fool of again is louder than reason. He finally turned to look at her, his expression open in a way she had rarely seen. I did not marry you, expecting to feel anything beyond the practical comfort of a well-run household. I did not anticipate finding myself unwilling to imagine the house without you in it. That unfamiliarity, I think, made me quicker to fear the worst tonight than you deserved. Then trust me now, instead of the ghost of a woman who wronged you years ago. Ilara held his gaze steadily, refusing to let the moment slip into easy forgiveness before she had said what needed saying. I will not spend this marriage paying for a debt someone else left you. I have already spent enough of my life being punished for choices that were never mine to begin with. I will not accept it from you as well. The words seemed to strike something loose in him, some final piece of armor he had been unwilling to set down until that moment. You are right, he said quietly, and I am sorry. I will find whoever sent that letter, and I will make certain the truth is known publicly, not only within this carriage. It did not take long to discover the source. A maid who had once served in Camille's household, dismissed weeks earlier under circumstances no one had bothered to explain to Ilara, came forward after the Duke's steward began quietly making inquiries, admitting that she had been paid to deliver the forged letter to several prominent households, including Lady Pemberton's. The instructions, and the coin that accompanied them, had come from Camille herself. Ilara received this news not with the fury she might have expected weeks earlier, but with a tired, resigned sadness, the understanding that her sister's jealousy had not softened with time or consequence, only grown more desperate as her own marriage crumbled and Ilara's, against every expectation, began to flourish. She thought of the conversation in her study, of Camille asking for help she had not truly wanted, and understood now that her sister had left Ravenswood that day not humbled, but resentful, searching for some way to drag Ilara back down to the unhappiness she herself could not escape. Before deciding what should be done with the truth, Ilara asked the Duke for one thing only, a chance to speak with Camille alone, without an audience, without the theater of a public gathering shaping either of their words. He agreed, though he insisted on waiting in the adjoining room, close enough to intervene should the conversation turn unkind in either direction. Camille arrived at Ravenswood the following afternoon, summoned by a note that gave no explanation beyond a request for her presence. She entered the study with none of the composure she usually wore, like a second skin, her eyes darting toward the closed door as though she already suspected why she had been called. I know about the letter, Ilara said without preamble, watching her sister's face carefully for the flicker of guilt she expected to find there. I know the maid you dismissed carried it to Lady Pemberton and 3 other households on your instruction, and I know you paid her to make certain it reached exactly the right ears to do the most damage. Camille's face drained of color, and for a moment she seemed to consider denying it outright, the old instinct to protect herself rising visibly behind her eyes. But something in Ilara's steady, unflinching gaze seemed to strip that instinct away, and instead her shoulders sank, the fight going out of her all at once. I did not think it would go so far. I only wanted you to feel, even briefly, what it was like to have something you built taken from you without warning. You wanted me to suffer the way I suffered when you took Julian. Yes, the admission came out small and raw, stripped of the confidence Camille had always used to disguise her uglier motives. I watched you become happier at Ravenswood than I have ever been in my own marriage, and I could not bear it. I told myself I deserved to be the fortunate sister, that I had simply moved first and claimed what I wanted, the way I always have. But watching you rebuild something better than what I stole from you, I could not stand it, so I tried to break it, the same way mine has already broken. Ilara felt no satisfaction in hearing the confession, only a tired, hollow sorrow for the sister she had once shared a bed with during thunderstorms, who had somewhere along the way convinced herself that another person's happiness was a debt owed to her own unhappiness. Do you understand what you have done, Camille? Not only to me but to yourself? You did not simply risk my marriage. You confirmed, in the eyes of everyone who hears the truth, exactly the kind of person you have always feared people might discover you to be. What will you do to me? That is not entirely my decision to make alone anymore, Ilara said quietly. But I will tell you this. I am done protecting you from the consequences of your own choices, the way our parents always did, the way I nearly did again by keeping this conversation private, instead of letting the truth stand on its own in front of everyone who was told a lie. You built this. You will have to be the one who lives inside what it becomes. Camille left the study in tears, and Alara did not follow her to the door, did not offer the comfort she once would have offered without thinking. Back when she still believed her sister's affection, however careless, was worth protecting at any cost to herself. That belief, she realized, watching the carriage disappear down the drive for what felt like the final time, had quietly died somewhere between the stolen engagement and the forged letter, and she found she did not mourn its passing nearly as much as she once feared she would. "What will you do with this information?" Alara asked the Duke that evening, once the truth had been confirmed beyond doubt. "That depends," he said, "on what you wish done. This is your family, and your name that was used as a weapon. I will not act without your wishes in this matter." Alara considered the question carefully, aware that whatever she chose next would shape not only her sister's future but her own place, in a world that had, for the first time in her life, begun to see her clearly rather than through the shadow of someone else's brightness. "I want the truth known," she said finally. "Not out of cruelty, but because I have spent my whole life having my story rewritten by other people's convenience, and I will not allow it to happen again, not even quietly, not even for the sake of family peace that was never real peace to begin with." The Duke nodded once, something like pride flickering across his face. "Then it will be done properly and publicly, so that no one in this county mistakes the truth for gossip a second time." The Pemberton household was hosting a gathering the following week, the very same drawing room where the rumor had first taken root, and it was there the Duke chose to see the matter closed. Alara had expected nerves as their carriage approached the house, but instead she felt something closer to calm certainty, the particular steadiness that comes from finally standing on solid ground after months of uneven footing. The room fell quiet the moment they entered, exactly as it had the night the rumor first spread, though this time the silence carried a different weight, curiosity rather than judgment, an audience waiting to see which version of the story would be confirmed. Lady Pemberton approached first, her earlier delight replaced by wary caution, aware perhaps that she had helped a lie travel farther than it deserved to go. "Your Grace," she began carefully, "I hope there are no hard feelings regarding my earlier questions." "None at all, Lady Pemberton, provided you are equally willing to hear the truth as readily as you were willing to repeat a falsehood." The Duke's voice carried clearly across the room, drawing the attention of every guest within hearing distance, exactly as he intended. "The letter attributed to my wife was a forgery, commissioned and paid for by her own sister, Lady Ashford, using a maid dismissed from her household for the purpose. I have the maid's signed account, along with the payment record, available for anyone who wishes to examine it, rather than continue repeating idle gossip as fact." A ripple of shocked murmurs moved through the room, heads turning toward Camille, who stood near the far window with Julian at her side, her face draining of what little color remained after weeks of strain. Julian's expression, Alara noticed, had gone rigid with something between embarrassment and fury, the look of a man realizing publicly, in front of people whose opinions mattered to him, exactly what kind of woman he had married. "This is absurd," Camille managed, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. "Why would I do such a thing?" "Because you have spent your entire life unable to bear watching your sister have anything you did not also possess," the Duke said, his tone even, without cruelty, simply fact laid bare in front of the room, the way he had once laid bare the terms of a debt in Alara's father's study. "You took her betrothed because his affection for her threatened the comfort of believing yourself the more fortunate daughter. When that theft did not bring you the happiness you expected, and her fortune rose regardless, you tried to destroy what she had built instead of examining what you had failed to build yourself." Alara stepped forward then, not because she needed the Duke to finish speaking for her, but because she wanted, finally, to close the story herself, in her own words, in the same room where it had so nearly been rewritten without her consent. "I am not here for revenge, Camille. I do not need it. I only wanted the truth known, because I spent enough of my life having my story told by other people's convenience, and I will not allow it to happen a second time. What you do with what remains of your own life is no longer any concern of mine." Julian did not wait for the gathering to end before leading Camille toward the door, his hand firm on her arm, his face set with the particular grimness of a man already composing the words of a separation in his mind. Whatever remained between them, Alara understood, watching them go, would not survive the walk to their carriage intact, and she found, watching her sister's rigid back disappear through the doorway, that she felt no triumph in it at all, only a quiet, closing sort of peace. The gathering resumed slowly around them, conversation returning in careful pockets. the particular hum of a room recalibrating itself around a newly settled truth. Several guests approached Alara throughout the remainder of the evening, offering quiet apologies for having entertained the rumor even briefly, and she accepted each one graciously, understanding that reputations, once shaken, take longer to settle than the truth alone can manage on its own. It was near the end of the evening, in a quiet corner away from the thinning crowd, that the Duke found her again, 2 glasses of wine in hand, offering one to her with a small, tired smile. "You handled that better than I did. You gave the facts. I only wanted to make certain the room understood I was not a victim waiting to be rescued, but a woman who had simply been telling the truth all along." Alara accepted the glass, studying him in the low candlelight, still faintly astonished by how far they had traveled from the cold negotiation of her father's study only months before. "Thank you, though, for believing me, in the end, and for saying so publicly, when it would have been easier to let the matter fade quietly. I did not do it only for your sake," he admitted, something unguarded in his voice that she had come to recognize as rare and precious, offered only when he trusted the moment enough to lower the careful walls he kept around himself. "I did it because I could not bear watching you carry the weight of someone else's lie one moment longer than necessary. I have spent a great deal of my life protecting myself from being made a fool by people I trusted. I did not expect, when I walked into your father's garden and found you crying beneath a willow tree, that I would end up wanting to protect someone else instead." Alara set her glass aside, studying him properly. The careful composure she had once mistaken for coldness now revealed, months into their marriage, as simply the armor of a man who had been hurt badly enough that gentleness felt like a risk he had nearly stopped believing he could afford. "You are not the man they whisper about in drawing rooms, you know. I do not think you ever were. Perhaps not entirely, though I confess the reputation served me well enough. In keeping certain people at a distance I preferred not to bridge." A faint, genuine smile crossed his face, the kind she had learned to treasure precisely because it came so rarely, and cost him so much to offer. "You, however, seem to have bridged it regardless, without my permission or my noticing, until it was rather too late to stop you. I did not set out to bridge anything, Your Grace. I simply refused to be afraid of you the way everyone else insisted I should be. I am beginning to understand that refusing to be afraid is rather central to your character, Alara. I find I admire it more than I expected to. When I first made you an offer, neither of us believed would become anything more than a convenient arrangement." They returned to Ravenswood that night in comfortable silence, the kind neither of them felt any need to fill with words. And Alara found herself, for the first time since the candles had burned low on the night her engagement was stolen from her, entirely at peace with the shape of her own life. She was no longer the overlooked daughter, waiting quietly at the edge of rooms for someone else's story to make space for her own. She was the Duchess of Ravenswood, mistress of a household that had come, slowly and honestly, to respect her, wife to a man who had learned, alongside her, that trust could be rebuilt even after it had been broken badly enough to leave scars. In the weeks that followed, word reached Ravenswood that Camille's marriage had ended quietly, Julian departing for an extended stay with distant relatives, rather than remaining under the same roof as a wife whose deception had cost him his standing among the very families whose opinions he had married her to secure. Alara felt, upon hearing the news, only the faint, distant sadness one feels for a storm that has finally passed after doing all the damage it was always going to do. Nothing left to mourn in it beyond what might have been, had different choices been made long before either sister ever stood in a candlelit hall listening to the wrong name announced. A letter arrived from her mother not long after news of Camille's marriage collapsed, the handwriting shakier than Alara remembered, the words carrying none of the practiced composure her mother usually wore like a second gown. Her mother wrote of regret, of watching one daughter's happiness rise while the others crumbled, of finally understanding, too late for it to matter much, that comparing her 2 daughters against each other had cost her the trust of both. She did not ask for forgiveness outright, only for the chance to visit, should Alara ever be willing to receive her. Alara sat with the letter for several days before answering, turning over the years of small slights and larger betrayals. The nights she had gone unheard in a house that always seemed to have room enough for Camille's feelings, and none left over for her own. She did not write back with easy forgiveness, because she no longer believed easy forgiveness served anyone honestly. Instead, she wrote a careful, measured reply, inviting her mother to visit in the spring, on the condition that the visit be built on honesty, rather than the comfortable pretending that had defined so much of her childhood. Her mother accepted, and though the visit that followed was not without its awkward silences, Alara found, watching her mother walk the gardens at Ravenswood with something like genuine wonder on her face, that there was room in her heart for a cautious, rebuilding sort of peace. even if it would never again be the uncomplicated love a daughter hopes for from a parent. Nora came to stay for a fortnight that same spring, her first true visit since Alara's wedding, and the two of them spent long afternoons walking the estate grounds together, Nora exclaiming over the gardens, the library, the household staff who had grown genuinely fond of their new mistress in the months since her arrival. "I told your mother you were the steadier one," Nora said one afternoon, settling onto the same stone bench beneath the willow tree where Alara had first met the Duke, though she did not yet know that particular detail of the story. "I did not know then how far that steadiness would carry you." It did not feel like steadiness at the time, it felt like survival. "Sometimes they are the same thing, my lady, worn different only by how the story ends." Nora patted her hand fondly, her eyes bright with an old woman's particular satisfaction at watching a child she had raised find her footing at last. "You built something real here. I hope you know how rare that is, and how much of it you built yourself, whatever the Duke's part in it." Alara thought of that conversation often in the weeks that followed, turning it over the way she once turned over Julian's letters before she had finally let them burn. Except this memory she kept without needing to release it, a small, steady comfort rather than a wound in need of healing. She had spent so much of her life believing her worth depended on being chosen first, on being the daughter who caught the good match, the sister who was not overlooked in favor of someone brighter. It had taken losing everything she thought she wanted to understand that being chosen by the right person, for the right reasons, mattered far more than simply being chosen first. One evening, several months into the new year, Alara found the Duke in the estate library, the very room where he had once left her 4 editions of a single book of poetry without being asked. He looked up as she entered, and something in his expression, open and unguarded in a way she had come to treasure above almost anything else in her new life, told her he had been waiting for her. "I have been thinking," he said, setting aside the papers in his lap, "that I never properly asked you the question that mattered. All those months ago in your father's study, I asked for your hand and you gave it, but I never once asked whether you might come to want this life for its own sake, rather than simply for the shelter it offered you when you had nowhere else to turn. And if I told you I want it for its own sake now? Then I would tell you," he said, rising to close the distance between them, taking her hand the way he had once taken it only to close a negotiation, though nothing about the gesture felt transactional now. "That I did not fall in love with the quiet, sensible woman I believed I was marrying for convenience. I fell in love with the woman who rode out into a burning night without being asked, who stood her ground against a housekeeper twice her tenure, who refused to let a room full of strangers decide her story for her twice in one lifetime. I did not expect to love my own wife, Alara. I find I do, entirely, and rather beyond my ability to remain composed about it, which I understand is not something anyone in this county believes me capable of feeling at all." Alara felt something loosen in her chest that had been tightly wound since the night her sister's name was announced instead of her own, some final, lingering fear finally releasing its hold. "I did not marry you expecting love either. I married you because it was the only door left open to me, and I walked through it because the alternative was a life decided entirely by other people's convenience. But I have come to want this, all of it, the household, the quiet evenings, the man who defends me without being asked and brings me books because I mentioned them once in passing. I choose you now, not because I have nowhere else to go, but because there is nowhere else I would rather be." He drew her close then, and for the first time since the night in the garden when he had found her crying beneath a willow tree, Alara let herself believe fully in the shape of the happiness in front of her, not a consolation for what had been taken from her, but something better, built deliberately, chosen freely, and entirely her own. Outside the library windows, the estate stretched quiet and settled under a clear winter sky, the household she had built with her own hands finally, completely, hers, and for the first time in her life, Alara Whitmore stood at the center of her own story, seen fully, chosen honestly, and unwilling ever again to let anyone else decide what she deserved.